Dr. Trexler.
Dr. Helms.
We're back for another episode of The Two Erics. And as we established in our last episode of Iron Culture, we thought we had a wedge between us, but really what that wedge was not anything substantial. And I do mean this as an insult, but it was rather Omar Isuf, like I said, not substantial. Rather just an agent of chaos who, because he doesn't have true meaningful human connection in his own life, is trying to prevent us from forming it. As we also established, the best way to deal with conflict in a group setting is to make sure that whenever you're all together, you just see if it's still there by not bringing it up and acting as though there's not conflict. And then when the person is not there, that's when you air your grievances and you let them hear about it by listening to the podcast after the fact. So I think we started that pathway of reconciliation between you and I last episode by essentially taking that angst and hiding whatever did exist between us and then directing anything remaining towards Omar. And I think in the spirit of restorative justice, that really is not at all in the spirit of restorative justice, to be serious for a second, what we're going to do now is try to find some common ground by talking about what I was accused of having a bias towards protein intake, but looking at it from a different angle, not protein to enhance performance, enhance lean body mass retention, get yiggity yacked, jiggity jacked, or striggity strong. I think the kids are saying that these days. But instead, how does the divergence between an appropriate protein intake for health and longevity play out in the research and in different models, from observational to comparative groups, to looking at individual nutrients versus a whole diet, looking at animal models, and then seeing how do those animal models translate to humans, if they do at all. What kind of associations do we see? What potential causative mechanisms are there? And the thing that none of us bodybuilders want to be true is, are there divergent outcomes with high protein intakes where you're potentially sacrificing health or GASP, performance and body composition? Actually, not GASP. If you told me I'm sacrificing my health to be a better bodybuilder, I'd be like, I'd take that every time. I'm just kidding. Obviously, I'm a natural bodybuilder, so I've drawn that line in the sand somewhere. But I think this is a really good discussion to have, because if we do have one shared bias in the bodybuilding community, regardless of whether we think it's Menser, regardless of whether we think it's Arnold, regardless of whether we think it's Palumbo, or regardless of whether we think it's, Lee Haney, high carb, low fat, we all think protein is awesome. And we will do whatever cognitive gymnastics we need to maintain a positive bias towards protein being good for all things. But maybe, just maybe, too high of protein intakes in the long term could be detrimental for health. It's hard for me to even say that, Trexler.
Yeah, it's one of those things. I remember encountering this idea for the first time when I was much, much younger. I think I might have been like 20 years old, maybe 21, when I was really in my peak. Like, I lived to train, like just perpetually in the gym. And I remember hearing this, and my first thought was, and when I say this, I mean the idea that like maybe protein restriction makes you live longer. When I first heard that, I was very much in the phase of my life. There was that cliche saying where it was like, I don't care if I die young as long as they need to bury me in a very big box, just
right.
Get huge.
Die young, big coffin, baby.
Yeah. Get huge, whatever it takes. I didn't really care all that much. But I still thought, well, it would sure be convenient if whatever was best for me as a bodybuilder was also best for me in terms of my health and longevity. Fitness is weird because when you first get into it, you kind of associate it with health. And then you get into bodybuilding and you notice that like the best bodybuilders on the planet are in the poorest health of any person that you would categorize as an athlete in many cases. So that's always a weird realization to make when you're following like the untested bodybuilding stuff. And then you start to realize, okay, that maybe there is a distinction between trying to be a great bodybuilder and trying to be the healthiest person But for natural bodybuilders, we would like to think that anything we do for our bodybuilding endeavors or pursuits will also be good or maybe neutral for our health, right? But when I was at Ohio State,
or temporarily bad, I'll accept that one.
temporarily, yeah, you prep, all of a sudden your hormones look kind of weird, and then they go back to normal, a few months later, right? We can live with that. I think the title of the paper I wrote with Andrew Pardue and Lisa Sprott, it was like unfavorable but transient changes, so the transient part is key there. But yeah, I remember during my undergrad, I was taking a survey course, like a little seminar course, I guess, and it was all about longevity. And it was a cool concept. It was kind of interdisciplinary, and we talked about some pretty wacky ideas in there. But one of the things that came up was the emerging, at that time, we're back in maybe 2010-ish when I took this course, some of this emerging data indicating that there are two interventions that seem to be making stuff live way longer in laboratories. And when I say stuff, I mean not humans. The two things that seemed to be most promising at the time were, one, caloric restriction, and two, protein restriction. So when I heard that, I said, okay, caloric restriction, all I'm hearing there is staying jacked and lean will make me live longer. So far we're good, right? But then the protein restriction one really got me a little bit uncomfortable. Not so uncomfortable that I would think about changing. Like I said, I was all about just getting huge and dealing with the ramifications. But as I got older and, thought more about like, hey, I'd like to live a while, it's one of those things that I revisited. And most recently, I revisited this concept in a Mass article that got published last month. And by the way, folks, you should check out massresearchreview.com. It's a lovely monthly publication there. But so I was interested in kind of revisiting this topic because I think it's one of the questions that I get really, really frequently by folks who, I think I've kind of, just through the content I've made over the years, when people are going to message, kind of an evidence-based fitness content maker, if it's like pure high level, like super elite bodybuilding questions, those don't really come to me because I haven't really been making a lot of that content. But when it's like at that middle ground between like, I kind of want to be jacked and strong, but I want to feel great and I want to be healthy and I want to live for a while, a lot of that more like kind of like semi-serious lifter, but also kind of life, I just want to live a good life and feel healthy and good. That's kind of like the questions that find their way to me. And I've been getting a lot of folks who are saying, hey, what do I do about this apparent trade-off here where protein seems to be, yeah, go ahead.
Do you know why they're contacting you, Trex?
No.
Because when they contacted me, I just shamed them for even suggesting that longevity or health is anywhere near in the same conversation as optimizing their bodybuilding.
Yeah.
And then they're searching someone for who's maybe nicer and kinder. I don't think that's what they need, but I guess if I give them what they need, you give them what they want, hand in hand.
Yeah, it's interesting because I noticed that, back when I had a full roster of clients and I would think about who kind of gets filtered toward me through this wacky industry that we live in. And it was like my typical client would be someone who could do well at a powerlifting meet, but doesn't wish to compete. And someone who could probably do okay in bodybuilding, but doesn't want to put themselves through that last part of prep where things get really crappy, right? So they want to be jacked, and they are, but they don't want to go from that like 8.5%. I'm actually kind of comfortable here, and I really love how I look. They don't want to go for that wild ride where you say, let's go down to 5 and then rebound up to 11 because it's our first time doing it, and then live in this, they don't want to invite that phase of their life just yet,
So you coach sane people, that's what you're saying.
That's one way of putting it, yeah. So those are the kind of questions I get, which is like, I want to be jacked, but also kind of my top priority is I want to watch my, I want to chase the grandkids around someday, things like that. So I think first things first, I want to maybe first talk about the just general concept that protein restriction is good for longevity. Okay. So caloric restriction and protein restriction, like I said, are the two kind of most promising interventions when you look at the longevity research for just increasing not just lifespan, but also health span, which is basically the proportion of your life where you're still able to, you're healthy and you're doing the stuff you like, basically. Because, people talk about lifespan a lot, and I don't think that's really what people are trying to extend, right? Like if you got to the point where you were in such poor health, you could no longer do any of the things that you enjoy, and you're constantly feeling unwell, you don't really want 30 more years of that. Right? You want more years of the good stuff where you're able to feel good on a day-to-day basis and do the things that you enjoy. So when I talk about longevity or lifespan, what I'm really talking about this whole episode is going to be health span, the years that you can kind of do the things you love and feel great. But anyway, yeah, the two interventions there are caloric restriction and protein restriction that have gotten a lot of attention over the years. I know some folks will lead you to believe that there's a few supplements that are like the key to healthy aging. The literature in that realm is very weak, so I'm just going to leave it there. Resveratrol, I can't believe that it's still got a market for longevity stuff. I just can't wrap my head around that. There's some new ones emerging, and there will be more to come, because that's just kind of a perpetual thing. Supplements, every now and then I'd be driving around and turn on the local radio on like a Sunday afternoon, and there'd be this like hour-long radio program that would just talk about these wacky supplements. And it was kind of a bummer because you could tell that these like infomercials, first of all, they were nonsense. And second of all, they were definitely tailored to like older people who are just very scared, So It's not supplements, guys. But when you look at the caloric restriction research, it actually does seem like mechanistically, it probably could translate to some extent to humans, but it's not without consequence, So the obvious one with caloric restriction is that if you want to replicate the research that's been done in flies and worms and mice, and you want to use caloric restriction to increase your lifespan and your health span, the magnitude matters with caloric restriction. And the really impressive results that have been observed in all these various models, they are associated with a magnitude of caloric restriction that you would not want to do, and a human likely would not do in a scenario where they had access to food that wasn't provided to them, right? So it works well in, for flies and for rodents and things like that, because you can give them the food they have, and that's that. Right? Like the compliance is not an issue in that scenario. The most likely scenario is that if you try to replicate straight up the magnitude of restriction that's observed in those studies, you would probably not be able to. And if you were able to, you would probably not enjoy it very much. You'd be probably quite miserable during that extra however many years you're squeezing out of it. So that's a major limitation for feasibility, and just like, not just feasibility, but like, is it worth it, right? To live a longer life where you're not really stoked about it.
So what kind of magnitude of relevant, like of energy restriction is associated in these animal models with enhanced longevity? What kind of we talking about here?
I'd have to, whenever you go on a monologue, I will go dig up a paper that has exact numbers, but it's a pretty substantial, I think they take their normal food intake and cut it by maybe like 40% or something like that.
That was roughly what I was thinking as well. And I think going back to bodybuilding, I have actually wondered, based upon some of this research, if we looked at people who compete well into their master's categories and started at a relatively young age, it would be very challenging to do like age match controls. Or I think, there's a limited number of twins on the planet. There's probably an even more limited number of twins who one of them decided to compete in natural bodybuilding for their whole life. But it would be quite an interesting research question to assess, hey, did this whole I compete every other year and I've been doing so since my early 20s into my early 60s, so that basically a 40 or 30 year span of my life, I spent 4 to 6 months consuming 2/3 of my normal metabolically regulated energy requirement to maintain my quote unquote normal weight. I wonder if that would matter. I've actually thought that several times, and if I'd squeeze a few more years out of my life by me being the lifelong psycho that I am.
You know, it's interesting because I've also obviously thought about that, and I'm torn between the parallels with energy kind of chronic caloric restriction, but also the the kind of less favorable literature pertaining to weight cycling. And so then you think about, okay, well, with weight cycling, is the negative impact we've observed with chronic weight cycling mitigated in a scenario where that weight regain is just a controlled, totally normal return to baseline versus some kind of like yo-yo dieting and perhaps overshooting and rapid weight gain, which I would imagine more rapid weight gain is probably a little bit tougher in terms of like storing more visceral fat and things like that, or, adipocyte hyperplasia maybe. Anyway, I'm speculating. I don't know, but it's a really interesting thing where you could see the advantage and you could also see the detriment, and you kind of have to wonder what the balance is there. Maybe you should have a kid and then do a lifelong case study. I feel like that'd be worth it.
I don't see anything wrong with forcing my child into this. But in all seriousness, I have thought about the weight cycling thing too on the other side of it. But I think there is a difference, because bodybuilders are intentionally gaining weight post-competition. Now, sometimes the rate, the composition, and the control they have over that recovery period is not as much agency as they would like it to have, at least in more novice competitors. But it is intentional. And as another shout out for Mass Research Review, can I just say, in April, our April 1st issue, we've got a really interesting article that I've written about the psychology of refeeds, where it indicates that those who do better with ad libitum feeding are maybe really good at intuitive eating in the context of bodybuilding, which is somewhat blasphemy for a weight neutral approach. But anyway,
people are going to think it's an April Fool's situation being released on April 1st.
Anyone who's that I didn't think about that, but it is not. I will tell you that prospectively in mid-March here. But I do think that's an interesting question, because much like the original diet break research didn't actually study breaking the diet, they studied breaks in the diet. I think weight cycling versus cycling your weight are not necessarily the same thing. And this tangent is now over, and I will give it back to you.
Okay. Yeah. Well, your monologuing got me to a spot. I got a number for you. Most of the experimental models of caloric restriction that are intended to extend lifespan, what they do is, my hunch was right. Basically, they take what would normally be like a comfortable energy intake for that species, whatever it is, and they cut that by about 30 or 40% and just say, cool, keep eating that forever. Okay. Now, in some species, that leads to a pretty impressive extension of lifespan. But basically, everything I'm talking about here about caloric restriction and protein restriction, I'm leaning on literature by John Speakman and his colleagues. He's a legend in this area. He popularized the dual intervention point model that you and I are both very, very fond of. But anyway, Speakman and Hambly estimated that for a human, if you started a 30% energy restriction, so on the lower end of what we usually see in these experiments, if you started that at age 48, it would probably only extend your expected lifespan by about 2.8 years, so almost 3 years. But you're talking about living your 50s, 60s, 70s, and I forget what the expected life, I forget what life expectancy was at the time that they made this estimate, but you're putting in decades of pretty big sacrifices to squeeze out an extra 3 years at the end. So even though the mechanisms are likely to carry over, the magnitude that's predicted by experts in this area, I personally, everyone's different. I wouldn't sign up for that.
No, I wouldn't either. And I think this is also a really interesting connection to something we've talked about previously, the difference between energy availability and an energy deficit. I think when you think in these terms of, hey, energy deficit, it's a fixed thing, that's not what we're talking about here. If you were to to 30% caloric restriction, you would eventually reach equilibrium, but you'd be doing so probably slightly below your lower intervention point in a state of low energy availability and experiencing substantial weight loss, leading at least in part to adaptive thermogenesis, so that you became weight neutral at a lower than predicted energy intake. So you're basically getting to the end of contest prep and going, sweet, we're staying here.
Yeah. And I will say that reminds me of the other downsides. So I mentioned there are two kind of drawbacks. So one was feasibility and also just, do you want to do it? But a second drawback with caloric restriction as a longevity tool is that, again, John Speakman has a really great kind of theoretical model. I forget exactly what he called it. I think it was the empty cupboards, something like that. But basically the idea was, he kind of created a fun little scenario to explain what he was getting at. But basically, you're locked in your house and you got some food in the cupboards and basically there's no more food coming in, right? So at first, no big deal. You start eating the stuff in the cupboards, you got some food around, you eat what you got. Eventually, you're going to get to the point where there's no more food in the cupboards. And then what, right? You still have to eat. So in his little metaphor or little kind of story that goes with it, he says, then you start eating the house plants. And now it's at the point where you're eating stuff you shouldn't be eating. And this is no longer a good situation. So the analogy there, or the metaphor, is that when humans are undergoing pretty severe caloric restriction, at first, no big deal. We're doing autophagy. That's a buzzword. People like that. We're breaking down fat. No big deal. That's what it's there for. But at a certain point, you're going to start making some constraints to your energy budget that are not good, or they're not without consequence, right? So, for example, what if you were undergoing chronic energy restriction like this, because you are one of those few folks who can really do this, and you're in it for the next 30 years. But what happens if you, I don't know, are exposed to a very dangerous pathogen? Are you sure that you will have the energy resources necessary to mount an effective immune response to that pathogenic threat? Is it possible that you might actually be more susceptible to dying early from some random infectious illness because of something that has nothing to do with all those cardiometabolic benefits that you're getting from caloric restriction, right? Because we don't know exactly what's going to kill us. It could be something cardiometabolic, it could be cancer, but it could also be that you just get exposed to the wrong germ at the wrong time and you get an infection and you don't have the energy to actually mount an effective immune response to it, because that is an energy intensive process. And
if I could just say, if this played out as this one thing being the key to longevity, I think we would have predicted that maybe sometime in the pre-agricultural era, we would have been living to maybe 80, 90, rather than that happening after food availability became a thing. But actually what we saw is the average height being about half a foot shorter and people dying in their 40s and needing to have 10 kids to survive and kind of continue the tribe. So,
right.
Yeah. I think the observational data would support that supposition.
Yeah, and of course there were folks who lived, as far as we know, for quite a while back then. It was, there's a lot of childhood mortality that brings down and a lot of just dangerous stuff that brings down life expectancy. But no, I mean, there's the threat of infection. There is, one of the things you need a lot of energy for is wound healing, right? And so there are a lot of threats to your ability to survive that are introduced by severe caloric restriction, despite the fact that from a cardiometabolic perspective, intensive caloric restriction may extend your lifespan if nothing else kills you, right? So that's kind of a big if and quite a gamble when you consider how unpleasant that intervention would be. So with all that stuff in mind, people said, okay, I'm probably not going to do caloric restriction as a human being, but what about protein restriction? So that's an interesting one. People like us would not want to do it, but some folks would say, yeah, actually, I don't really like eating meat all that much. I could do, Oreos as the main course. That sounds fine to me. But so with protein restriction, what's interesting about that, with caloric restriction, the mechanisms seem to generally carry over, albeit to a lesser magnitude. With protein restriction, the data from insects are quite good. Protein restriction seems to be really good for longevity of insects. So if you've got if you've got a lot of insects as pets, keep that in mind. But when you start translating that into mammalian animal models, things don't really seem to be quite as effective. And so there's really not a lot of hope that we will get a even reasonably meaningful effect size, I would say, from protein restriction if the goal is longevity. So Speakman and colleagues in a different paper estimated that even if you went pretty extreme with it, where you reduced your protein intake from 20% of your energy intake, so 20% of calories, all the way down to 4, which is a very, very low protein intake. That magnitude of effect would probably only be half as much as the typical caloric restriction intervention, which, as we already discussed, we talked about doing it for basically 30 years to squeeze out an extra 3 years. So this type of pretty extreme protein intervention would have a dramatically smaller effect than that. And I know that some people, probably not listening to this episode, but some folks in the world might say, that's fine, I'll do it, because what I'll do is caloric restriction combined with protein restriction, and I'm going to maximize both of those, and I'll get something, I'll squeeze everything I can out of it. And that brings me to my most recent Mass article, which is, it was a review of a paper by Korat and colleagues. It was published last month, my review was, and it was looking at the effect of protein intake in midlife and seeing how that correlated with what they call healthy aging. So this was the type of study where they intervened, kind of around middle age. No, they didn't intervene, I should say. They got in contact with these folks around middle age. They were involved in this long, huge cohort study called the Nurses' Health Study. So a bunch of American nurses. And when I say large, I mean, in this particular analysis, they had almost 50,000 people, and that's not even the whole sample. So it's a type of study where they check in around midlife and say, okay, let's get some information about how you're living, what you're doing, and let's actually follow you and kind of track you, over the trajectory of your life. And so in this case, they were able to kind of fast forward like 30 years and say, okay, for the people who were doing these different behaviors 30 years ago, how'd that turn out for you? How have things been going in terms of your aging? And so what they did, they defined healthy aging as, because that's such a vague term, right? You have to have an operational definition to say what you're actually measuring here or testing. So healthy aging in this study was defined as the absence of major chronic diseases, good mental health, and no impairment in either cognitive function or physical function. Okay, so that doesn't seem like a particularly, an unbelievably high bar that you would have to clear, right? No major chronic diseases, good mental health, good cognitive function, good physical function. I feel like if you randomly polled some people and said, do you think you're asking too much to hope that you have that at 65, 70? I think a lot of people would say, no, that's what I'd like. That's what I'm aiming for. I don't think that's too much to ask, right? And in this study, there's a few interesting findings that kind of popped out to me. First of all, the number of folks who cleared those bars, who met all criteria for healthy aging, of the 49,000 participants almost, there were only 3,700 who met all 4 of those criteria. So that was 7.6% of this sample. To me, I was expecting and hoping that would be probably closer to 30%. And in hindsight, I'm very naive, right? But yeah, less than 10% actually aged in a way that these researchers would consider healthy aging. So that to me was very sobering. I think one of the really interesting things that, we all love confirmation bias, right? Who wouldn't? One of the things that I think folks listening to Iron Culture will feel good about, because it supports a lot of their biases, is when you look at, from these 4 different criteria, what was the one that was holding people back the most from being able to say, yes, I'm aging in a healthy way, I'm checking all these boxes? It turns out, from this sample of almost 49,000 people, there are actually a lot of folks who cognitively were in good shape. like 23,000 people were able to check that box and say, I have no impairment in cognitive function. I'm good. So that's great. Good mental health.
Is it possible, Eric, that they ticked the box incorrectly because they were not in good cognitive health?
No. And I resent the attempt at humor when we're talking about such serious matters.
I apologize.
It's okay. I forgive you already. Now, mental health status, again, 18,000. Of course, you'd want it to be higher, but that's a decent number of people that are saying, yeah, I'm still in good mental health. Absence of chronic diseases, 15,000. So in these cases, we're talking about, plenty of folks who are doing okay cognitively, emotionally, not currently having a chronic disease. The biggest limiting factor to being able to say in this study, I aged in a healthy way, was physical limitations. There were only 7,300 people who could say, from this huge cohort of 49,000 people, at the end of this follow-up period, yep, I can still report that I have no physical limitations. So even if you don't even care about all this protein stuff, I think that is a sobering number, and it's an important number, and it kind of reinforces how critical it is. Now, you can't prevent every cause of physical limitation, but one of the best things you can do for the most preventable sources of physical limitation is exercise. Exercise through resistance training, through cardio, through a combination, whatever it takes to be active. Exercise is absolutely critical for maintaining that function as we age. Now, here's where the protein comes into it. The purpose of this study was really to see how protein intake in these middle-aged female nurses would be predictive of their ability or likelihood of aging in a healthy manner. And so what they did was they looked at protein intake, but they also split it up. So they looked at, how beneficial was or detrimental was higher total protein intake. And then they looked specifically at animal protein. And then they looked specifically at dairy protein, kind of a subset of animal protein. And they also specifically looked at plant protein. And the odds ratios were kind of the main finding here in terms of how much did this increase your odds of aging in a healthy manner? So total protein, the odds ratio was 1.05, which means, increased your odds of healthy aging by 5% for a given increase in protein intake, right? The exact slopes and stuff, this is an audio medium. People aren't really going to digest it that well anyway, but basically 5% increase in the odds of more healthy aging for every 3% energy increment. So pretty good.
Hold the phone, Trex.
What?
This whole time, you've been building me up. You've been saying, hey, protein restriction, potential option for living longer. And then the big headline here is that higher protein intakes were associated with a greater likelihood of healthy aging. Man, I feel really good right now.
You feel good. Well, yeah, it gets even better though. So that was for total protein intake. Relatively small effect, but positive. So if you were worried that protein was going to make you age more poorly or be very unhealthy in terms of longevity and aging, this would directly contradict that. Looking at animal protein, the odds ratio is 1.07, so pretty much the same, kind of a modest but positive effect. Looking at dairy protein, 1.14. So that's where I would say, okay, it looks like dairy might actually be better than, kind of animal protein in general. So we can think of dairy versus, maybe meat and poultry. And then when you look at plant protein, this was kind of the most striking finding that got a lot of attention. The odds ratio is 1.38. So plant protein really had separated itself from the pack in terms of having not just a positive association with healthy aging, but a fairly large positive association with healthy aging. So in my Mass article, I talked a little bit about why that might be. Now, you kind of encouraged me to tap the brakes, which I think was really good because I was on a roll there. And I do think it's important to take a second and just say, okay, at the bare minimum, this study is telling us that protein is probably good, not bad, when it comes to healthy aging. And when you look back at the stats I was talking about earlier, it's not hard to imagine why. If the biggest limitation in this sample for healthy aging is physical limitations, then it would make sense that, folks who are hopefully being active but also eating adequate protein are probably doing what they can to stave off sarcopenia, right? The age-related loss of muscle mass and muscle function. And for me, that's always been the thing top of mind when I hear this debate about protein restriction being good for health. Well, as someone who's in the more, I wouldn't say but someone who was trained in the allied health sciences, the next generation of health professionals is being told time and time again, sarcopenia is a major public health issue. We have an aging population, at least in America, and we know that we're going to need people to help folks who have severe physical limitations due to age-related loss of muscle and strength. So there's always been this dissonance where you're telling me from a metabolic perspective, protein restriction is good, but then you're telling me from this kind of sarcopenia-focused perspective that we need to do everything we can to make sure that older people have a ton of muscle mass. And protein intake would certainly be supportive of that goal when combined with exercise. So that's a really important finding. And like I said, it's not super surprising when you look at this and you see that, the main limitation in the sample was physical limitations that were getting in the way of healthy aging. So that alone is really important. And I think for a lot of folks who are into bodybuilding and fitness, it kind of helps you breathe a sigh of relief where you say, okay, this animal model research that protein restriction is super good is probably not going to apply to me anyway. And even if it did, it looks like our biggest thing we want to worry about is just not having sarcopenia so that we can age in a healthy way. So it looks like protein in general is going to be associated with more healthy aging with all other things held equal. But yeah, go ahead.
I got questions, and you're probably going to cover this anyway, but I value my own voice far more than I should. So my question here is, this is an analysis of healthy aging, not all-cause mortality, right?
Mm-hmm.
So initially we were talking about protein restriction expanding lifespan, not necessarily health span. And this analysis is health span. That's what we're talking about here.
Yeah.
So do we think there might be a difference if we had done this analysis, but just simply looking at lifespan?
I don't think so. From the literature I've seen, it generally seems to be in line with that general finding, which is that, protein, I don't know if it has a positive effect with regards to all-cause mortality, but I've not seen literature strongly indicating a negative effect. So I don't think we have to view it as a trade-off where it's like you paradoxically increase health span while shaving years off the end, right? So it's like you have a better ride, but it ends abruptly. I don't see that in the literature, especially in models that do a good job of correcting for some of the other things that come with animal protein, like, processed meat intake and high, intake of fatty red meats and things like that, or low vegetable intake. There are these certain kind of behaviors that cluster with high meat intake that are not always positive. So, you can find papers that go a lot of different directions with this when it comes to all-cause mortality, and the devil's in the details in terms of how effectively did you control for some of those things that seem to correlate with the intake of certain meat options, right? So I think it does tell that same general story where for all-cause mortality, it seems like protein itself is fine, especially from a plant-based diet, where you're less likely to see a lot of those kind of more deleterious confounders associated. And then when you see folks who are on really meat-heavy, high-protein diets, but they're, maybe they smoke more, maybe they drink more alcohol, maybe they consume more fried foods, more processed meats, then we start to see that maybe things can go the other way, not because of the protein, but because of some of the things that come with certain types of protein. And I think that maybe is a good segue into what most of our listeners are going to be most interested in. Because listen, Helms, there's no way if I told you, hey, actually severe protein restriction is good for aging, no one's doing it, right? We're not interested. So I think most people, when they saw this study, if they saw it in the headlines or in mass, they were thinking, okay, well, I might be open to shifting the amount of protein that I'm getting from plants versus animals. Like this might be doable as long as I can still achieve my goals in terms of being strong, gaining muscle, all that stuff. And we've covered many studies in the last few years indicating that plant-based proteins are totally viable options for getting optimal protein intake to support, strength gains and gains in muscle mass. So the question is, from a health perspective, if they can be equivalent when approached effectively for strength and hypertrophy, is there a meaningful health advantage of getting more of your protein from plants rather than getting it from animal sources? So that's where I did focus most of my mass article. And I think there's really two ways that you can interpret this study that I'm talking about, where we saw a higher odds of healthy aging, specifically from plant-based protein intake relative to animal-based. You might be wondering what's going on there. And I think there's a couple leading candidates for what's going on there. First of all, it very well could be that there is a real biological, physiological thing happening here. Okay, so there's a study by John P. Ritchie Jr. and colleagues that came out this year, actually, where they did a study on sulfur amino acid restriction. Okay, and this was kind of new to me. I was not aware of this, but apparently there's been a body of literature building over the years where in various animal models, restricting sulfur amino acids, specifically methionine and cysteine, restricting those in the diet seems to be delaying the aging process and reducing the prevalence of age-related diseases and improving a bunch of metabolic outcomes in lab animals. And so in this study, they actually wanted to translate it to humans, to healthy humans, which a lot of the anti-aging research and the longevity research never really gets to that point. People, they'll say, okay, we've got enough to put on the back of the supplement label, let's pack it up here. Or it just starts to fall apart as they go from worms and flies to mice to non-human primates. At some point in that kind of long march toward human research, they say, we're either getting adverse events or it's just not working anymore, right? So it is kind of unusual to see this type of work being translated. And the short version of the findings, it's not like they had them do it for 40 years and they said, okay, who died earlier, right? They were looking at a bunch of biomarkers that might be associated with better or worse, cardiometabolic outcomes. I think generally the results leaned in favor of being, slightly more favorable in the folks who were restricting these sulfur amino acids compared to the control diet. But I didn't see anything in this paper that for me was starting to make me think, okay, I really got to get serious about cutting methionine from my diet. And that's pretty important because if you get a lot of your protein from animals, you're not cutting methionine from your diet. It's just not going to happen. If you're eating, what are typically considered high quality protein sources, you're getting your methionine whether you like it or not. Now, when it comes to plant-based protein sources, some have plenty of methionine and some don't. They don't lack it entirely, but some plant-based protein sources are quite low in methionine. So you theoretically could limit your methionine intake pretty considerably. However, whenever we talk about how a plant-based diet can be just as good for building muscle and strength and all that stuff, we are assuming that you are not going to have a major gap in your essential amino acid intake. And if you're eating a pretty typical balanced diet, you won't. But if you go out of your way to intentionally restrict methionine, I suspect that it would unfavorably impact your ability to gain muscle. Methionine is an essential amino acid, and if you're lacking it, that's not going to be good for building muscle.
Yeah, I think that's the key point here, right? Is that methionine is an essential amino acid. It's largely found in meat and dairy, but it is still an essential amino acid. So that if you were able to construct, a vegan or vegetarian or plant-based diet that was just simply low in animal proteins, that was low in methionine, it would also be relatively incomplete in terms of essential amino acid content.
Yeah.
Trex, I don't want to derail you too much, but I do have a question here, kind of going back to the initial analysis.
Sure.
These are not nurses who are consuming bodybuilding diets, right?
Correct.
They're not going out of their way to consume high proteins and high protein diets in terms of total gram amounts or percentage of calories from their diet. And I think that's something that sometimes is missed when there's these continuous analysis or directional analyses where we just talk about low, moderate, high protein. Sometimes I've seen categorical groupings where the high protein group is anything over 1.1 grams per kilogram of protein, which would be considered low in other contexts. So do you think it's worth framing, and maybe we don't have the data, at least not in terms of health span or even lifespan, do you think it's worth framing the kind of dosage that is generally something that might be reasonable for health, and if it differs from where we think reasonable dosages for maximizing hypertrophy and strength, which has come down over the years, if anything?
Yeah. So, I mean, I can tell you that in this study, in terms of total protein, the quintiles, right? So the lower 20% and then the next higher, all the way up to the top 20%, the median intakes. And when you look at these kind of studies that are looking at all-cause mortality and healthy aging and with the more clinical research, it's usually going to be framed as percentage of energy, which for us kind of sucks because we'd love to see it in, grams per kilogram or total grams per day. But I can tell you the median intakes in these different quantiles going from first to fifth, 14.6% of energy, 16.5, 17.3, 19.4, and then up to 21.9% of energy in the highest quintile. So that kind of addresses the first part of your question. And of course, people outside of the science world extrapolate very differently from people inside of the science world. In science, extrapolate can be a bad word because sometimes what you're saying is, well, we've got this little tiny snapshot of protein intakes, and let's just assume that this goes all the way out linear forever, right? And of course, in physiology and biology, we cannot just assume linearity at all times. Usually there's basement effects and ceiling effects and, various asymptotes in various relationships. So without question, I think if you want to look at, in the bodybuilding world, what's an appropriate protein intake for longevity, I don't know. I think the best we can do is look at some of these directional relationships and look at, the mechanistic basis for those directional relationships and kind of intuit to the best of our ability how well those will translate to higher intakes. In this case, I feel pretty good about assuming, at the very least that protein intake is going to be slightly favorable for healthy aging due to what we've talked about with sarcopenia, and unlikely to have a negative impact on lifespan or all-cause mortality. That would be my impression of the data I've seen. In terms of how much protein is needed to maximize muscularity, or how much we ought to be looking for, that is an area where I'm actually going to probably, I don't know if I'm going to write about that again anytime soon, but I do think that I've got kind of it's weird because my feelings about it are strong, and every time I talk about it, I feel very pedantic because I end up saying my biggest gripe with protein guidelines in the evidence-based fitness world is not the location of the common range everyone talks about, but the certainty with which it's discussed. So, and
also potentially, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, not necessarily the certainty only, but also the difference in the magnitude of impact it'll have when you start crossing over those lines in the sand that we decide are where that certainty lies.
Yeah, so I'll admit, this week I spent too much time in R, my favorite software package for stats, and I was just messing around with stuff. And I was like, there's that classic figure in the paper by Morton and colleagues, which is a terrific paper. I love the paper. And I think that if you followed the guideline recommendations in it, you would not be leaving any gains on the table and you'd be quite happy with it. But that's kind of, as far as I can tell, that's the paper that I think really got the 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kilogram estimate, really got it popularized in the evidence-based fitness world. And there's that figure that shows the meta-regression with the break point. And I think
I was an author on it, I know.
Yeah. And this weekend, so like with that that analysis, there's just a few things to point out, which is that breakpoint analysis kind of insists that the second part, there should be a linear portion with a positive slope and then a slope of 0 on the second portion. But that's not how you have to model breakpoints. You could let that second segment have whatever slope it wants to have, just based on what the data are. So that introduces a layer of uncertainty, which is, what if we allowed the best fit lines to simply fit the data with no pre-existing assumptions about what the second slope ought to be? So that could move your breakpoint around so that you're no longer talking about 1.6. Maybe you're talking 1.4 or 1.8. In this case, it would move up a bit, actually, if you allowed that second segment to have whatever slope it wanted to have. However, what I consider a bigger point worth bringing up is the fact that it's an unweighted analysis. So every one of those data points has the same weighting in terms of how it impacts the regression slopes. Whereas in a typical meta-regression, you want the more precise effect estimates to have higher weighting in terms of how they're impacting the pooled analysis or the slope calculation. So I spent too much time in R when other people would be, I don't know, spending time with loved ones or taking a walk in the park. Right. I simulated 100 different, what I consider plausible weighting scenarios for that data. And, I'm going to publish that in mass this upcoming month, but basically there's a lot of variation in where that breakpoint ends up being located. I think 25% of the models that I simulated with very plausible weighting scenarios ended up having breakpoints that were below 1.6 grams per kilogram per day. So all of this is to say, even if you look at the original figure and you say, I don't care about weighting because I'm a normal person, and I don't care about assuming that second slope is 0 because theoretically it ought to be, right? If we're talking about when that benefit kind of stops getting better over time, right? Or as protein intake goes up, you can make a theoretical basis for saying, I don't care about the weighting and I don't care about that second slope. In the original analysis, the confidence interval spans the entirety of the data, basically.
1 to 2.2.
Yeah. Oh. So which basically means we think that the breakpoint is somewhere within the data, but we're not sure where. But 1.6 is our best guess, is kind of what that analysis says. And again, that's not being...
Can I say one thing? I know you're not attacking, but I did feel a little bit better after looking at a meta-analysis that came out in 2022 by Nunez and colleagues.
Yes.
Which also did some categorical analyses in a different way, didn't do a breakpoint analysis, and found generally higher effect sizes for, I believe, both lower body strength and lean mass accrual over 1.6 versus under.
Yeah.
So at the very least, what I can say is listen, pass the buck. Don't look at Morton and colleagues, who happen to be an author. Check out this other study. They said the same thing.
Yeah, and it's by the same group, right? It's by like Stu Phillips is the lead author or the senior author on it.
He's the senior author, yeah.
Yeah, and so my interest is not in being critical of the Morton paper or that specific analysis, because like I said, I think if you took that and ran with it, you'd be all right. And I think, as we continue to say, okay, is 1.6 enough? Seems to be in a lot of cases. Okay. What's interesting is that in the Nunez paper, they did a meta-regression with weighting, the way that you typically would in a meta-regression model. And I don't believe the data looked like they really required a breakpoint in terms of when you look at the continuous relationship between protein intake and effect size. So it does lead to some interesting questions that kind of arise from that. But anyway, my general take on how much protein you need as a lifter is that I don't think we have a really precise estimate for a lot of reasons that pertain to how studies are done and various, recruitment and different training programs from study to study. I think that we need a tremendous amount of data if we wish to have an actual precise estimate there. Mm-hmm. I think one of the things I've been kicking around, and I'm just going to get reckless here, Helms.
Let's do it.
So I don't believe that the concept of protein quality is useless. I struggle to believe that. And my bias is that I do eat a a pretty strict plant-based diet. Most days of the week I'm vegan. Every now and then I'll have a little bit of cheese or something in there just to, make it life easier on the people around me. So I'd love to say, hey, these protein quality scores are nonsense. Plant-based is just as good as animal-based. It seems like that is the case, that plant-based and animal-based diets lead to similar gains, specifically on high-protein diets, like when you get up into like the 1.6 gram per kilogram range. When we look at lower protein diets, there is a discrepancy. There's a gap where on low protein diets, an animal-based diet does better than a plant-based diet. I wouldn't be shocked if long after I'm dead, we look back and we say, okay, protein quality scores matter. What we find is that on a plant-based diet, you probably need 1.5 or 1.6 grams per kilogram per day. And maybe on an animal-based diet, depending on that proportion, because it's not going to be 100% animal-based. But if you're getting most of your protein from animal sources, I wouldn't be shocked if we end up eventually coming to recognize that, yeah, you're getting the lion's share of your gains down around 1.3, 1.4 grams per kilogram per day. I wouldn't be shocked if that ends up being where the dust settles on this debate. But I just don't think we have enough data yet to give really precise estimates with well-adjusted models that account for all the differences between studies in young versus older people and studies with this much volume versus that much volume in resistance training. So big tangent, but you asked for it, and that's my 2 cents.
No, it was a great tangent, and that I think the meta regression in Nunes for added protein in RCTs where they did resistance training wasn't even significant, even though there was an effect of adding protein. So I think, and when you look at the actual supplementary figure and some of the data, there's not a large effect for protein, period. And the difference when you do the categorical analysis of 1.59 grams per kg or lower versus higher, yeah, there's 2 different effect sizes, but there's a trivial difference between those effect sizes if we were to use kind of Cohen's guidelines. And then going all the way back to my original question, if you were to just kind of do some back of the hand math of what's the average caloric intake and body weight of a American woman, and then figure out what's 22% of that at the highest level, we're looking actually, interestingly enough, just over around like 1.6 gram per kilogram in the highest, I think it was quintiles in that study. So I think we can have a little bit of confidence here that when we're looking at the people who are consuming a high protein diet, quote unquote, based upon this look at health span, they are in the ranges, at least the ranges of what we might recommend if someone wanted to maximize strength and hypertrophy, at least if they're using kind of the lower end cutoff.
Yeah. So I think getting back to where I was going with this, circling all the way back to, we've hammered out those details, but the question was, how do we make sense of this apparent health advantage in the plant-based protein versus, animal-based protein? Like I said, it could have something to do with sulfur amino acid restriction. I'm not sold on that at all. In fact, I didn't. It was one of those things where the data in that study by Ritchie Jr. and colleagues directionally favored, restriction of these sulfur amino acids, but it seems difficult for me to kind of frame those findings as being clinically relevant without, further confirmation. I need to see something a little bit more impressive before I say, oh, that's why all the animals are living longer. It just didn't look like a whole lot was going on in terms of magnitude and clinical relevance. There's also a study by Zhao and colleagues from 2022 talking about restriction of various essential amino acids and how they impact certain outcomes. One thing that was really fascinating was, they did clarify, you can go through and alter intake of different essential amino acids and induce kind of distinct effects depending on which one that you're messing with. And one of the examples that they talk about is leucine. And so leucine deprivation in animals increases energy expenditure, reduces food intake, reduces fat mass, has a bunch of cardiometabolic advantages. And they also pointed out the same is true for methionine. But again, if you were going to restrict an amino acid two of the ones that you would not want to intentionally restrict if you were interested in building muscle are going to be leucine and methionine, right? So that kind of is forcing us to get back into this kind of wrestling match between better gains in the gym and, longevity outcomes. So again, these are mechanisms if we assume that what we're looking at here is, a true physiological effect of plant-based protein on health, and saying, okay, maybe the plant-based is better because we are probably getting lower intakes of leucine, methionine, and things like that, but apparently not to an extent that it's going to dramatically inhibit hypertrophy when we see these head-to-head studies. So I'm personally just putting my biases out there. I introduced those potential explanations to be transparent and to put all the cards on the table, but I actually don't think that what we're seeing here is really that simple, that it's just certain amino acids that are lower in plant-based diets. And I don't really think that's what's going on here. So the alternate interpretation of this data that seems to point to more healthy aging from higher plant-based protein relative to animal-based protein, I think there's a couple things that we have to consider in observational research like this. So first of all, one of the things that always comes up with anything about plant-based diets is healthy user bias, right? And what that refers to is the idea that if you are someone who is going out of your way, and now not everyone with low animal protein intake is in this boat, but if you're someone who has gone out of your way to restrict the intake of animal protein, there's a decent likelihood, based on the literature, just from a probability perspective, that you are doing a bunch of other stuff that is generally good for your health, right? If you've taken that step of consciously restricting your animal protein intake, you're more likely to be eating more vegetables, more legumes, more nuts and seeds, more fruits. You probably don't smoke as much. You probably don't drink as much alcohol. There's this whole cluster of behaviors that might be going along with that. And sure, you can try to adjust those things away statistically, but statistical adjustments are imperfect in nature. You can't adjust every element of a person's lifestyle out of the data. Try as you might. A related thing that isn't quite the same as healthy user bias is when someone makes a conscious decision, or even a subconscious decision. If someone is not consuming a lot of animal protein, but they are still getting plenty of protein in their diet, that's who we're talking about here for these folks on these plant-based high-protein diets. I think as someone who within the last several years switched from an omnivorous diet to a plant-based diet, I think back to what has changed other than my protein sources in the way that I consume a meal. And a lot of things have changed. I've noticed that my meal frequency goes down because sometimes it's not as convenient to go grab a quick bite to eat when you're on the run. I've noticed I eat more meals cooked at home rather than outside of the home, which usually correlates to eating stuff that's a little bit healthier when it's prepared at home. Most of the, really quick, energy-dense frozen dinners you might grab at the grocery store, that's changing slowly, but a lot of the ones that are really energy-dense and super convenient, they tend to have a lot of animal protein and animal products in them. And then I think about, when I switched over to a plant-based diet, if I was going to go out to a restaurant, where would I go? Back in the day, it might be a burger restaurant, right? So I'm eating processed meat, red meat, and I'm probably going to have a side of French fries with it. And maybe I have a couple beers because all those foods go together in this nice kind of I wouldn't say well-rounded, but it's a tasty meal, right? When I think about going out to eat at a restaurant as someone who's now on a plant-based diet, I might go to an Indian restaurant or a Vietnamese restaurant or a Thai restaurant. And, thinking the most recent place that I ate outside of the home, I went to an Indian restaurant, and it was a chickpea meal. And what side goes with a nice chickpea curry? It's not French fries, it's not something that's deep fried. It's usually, I'll have some rice and, it's not just the protein source that changes. It's what side dishes go with it. It's how many vegetables are included in the meal. It is what you're drinking as a beverage with the meal. And so I think go ahead.
And I just want to say, just to prove your point even more, I think when you look at certain things, even when you do moderator analysis and you control for some of these other effects statistically, you don't know that you're not looking at some fundamentally different people.
Right.
When I think about someone who's intentionally consuming a high protein diet that is largely vegetarian, there's a couple layers there of health-based decisions, effort put forth, a sense of agency, a willingness to change, and frankly, a level of intelligence and discernment that might be higher than normal. Because if you were just to go out and consume your typical media on, let's say, a vegan diet, and you had become convinced that you need to consume a plant-based diet for health reasons, let's say, for example, your typical media is going to tell you there's these overblown effects on high-protein diets, and protein is actually bad for you. And when you're looking at typical, probably not science-informed media, think about Game Changers and the level of critical thinking that was there. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about people who not only decided, I want to read into and potentially become more plant-based or vegetarian. However, I've also done some additional steps and I've thought about, what are the effects, the second-order effects of me going on a highly plant-based diet? My protein might be lower. I've consumed enough information that leads me to believe that's not ideal. So I'm going to make an effort to then try to increase not only my protein, which is a normal thing healthy people do, but it's harder to do when you're on a vegan diet. As someone who's switched from a omnivorous diet to, I call myself a flexitarian, because awesome, the word flex is in there.
Yeah.
But I've been all the way lacto-ovo strictly for years, all the way to now pescatarian, and when I travel, occasionally eating some poultry if I have to, but not purchasing meat for the home, only when I'm out, and almost always fish. So, like if you were just to check our fridge, you would think we were vegetarian, right? And it's harder, and it takes more effort. You have to come across the right information. You have to parse it out. And I think when you select for that, I'm not sure how good your typical epidemiological statistical controls are going to be of just going, right, let's control for BMI, let's control for age, let's control for SES, let's control for, smoking. And I think there's probably some uncaptured variables there.
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely a topic for a whole podcast, and probably with a guest, but with statistical adjustments in observational research, you can do a little bit here or there, but you cannot make fundamentally different people the same. There are limitations. And when you do have, two fundamentally different groups of folks, or multiple fundamentally different clusters of people, and you're trying to equate them artificially, you can run into some wacky stuff with the way that data. You go into it with the best intentions with these adjustments, but you can end up with some weird stuff and weird kind of like paradoxes that people have written about for decades and decades. So all of that is to say, I totally agree that sometimes people are too quick to throw out studies like this entirely and say, it's all healthy user bias, you can't even compare. But then other folks on the other end of the spectrum are way too quick to say, they adjusted for everything, it's fine. The reality is in the middle there, which is that statistical adjustment in this type of study is critical and useful, but not going to take care of every problem you have. There are some things that you can't really adjust your way out of. But I think it's probably, we've kind of danced around many different elements of this study and different interpretations, but I think I'd like to kind of bring it home and say what I really think is going on here.
Plant your flag, Trex.
I'm going to plant it. I did it with protein intake earlier. Now I'm going to do it again here with me continuing to complain about a completely suitable range that everyone likes. But when it comes to this study and thinking through why would we see such a uniquely advantageous effect from high plant-based protein intake, I go back to the healthy diet indicator criteria, okay? And these are two sets of criteria that, as you would expect, are supposed to generally reflect a healthy diet. Now, anytime you're talking about defining a healthy food or a healthy diet, there's going to be issues, right? We're trying to oversimplify a very complex thing here. But there were a set of criteria that came out in 2015 and 2020. And of all the different kind of criteria and scoring systems and grids and tables, I think these ones really sum up what I would just kind of like plop down on the table and say, if you do these things, you're probably going to be, on the right track here. So the healthy diet indicator criteria from 2015 basically say, eat plenty of fruits and vegetables. It's more specific than that, but I'm simplifying. Plenty of fruits and vegetables. Keep your fat maybe below 30% of energy. Saturated fat below 10% of energy. Polyunsaturated fat 6 to 11% of energy. Added sugars less than 10% of energy. At least 25 grams of fiber and at least 3,500 milligrams of potassium. Okay, and then when you go to the 2020 version, again, plenty of fruits and vegetables, plenty of beans and legumes, plenty of nuts and seeds, plenty of whole grains, plenty of fiber, some cap on total fat, saturated fat less than 10%, sodium less than 2 grams. That may not be necessary. Added sugars less than 10% of energy, processed meat 0 grams, and unprocessed red meat less than 71 grams a day. So get your scales out. Ultimately, if someone were to tell me, hey, Eric, I want to be healthy, what should I do? I'd hand them those. Obviously, there's some overlap between them. And I'd say, why don't you try to do most of this stuff and generally adhere to one of the 3 dietary patterns that seem to be recommended by just about every governing body and, scientific group that's in charge of putting out diet recommendations. And the 3 that they typically put out there for people who are interested in their health is something that looks like a Mediterranean eating pattern, or something that looks like a DASH eating pattern, or something that looks like a plant-based eating pattern. And I think the reason that the 3 of those come up so frequently is because they check a lot of these boxes of, fruit and vegetable intake, beans and legumes, nuts and seeds, whole grains. If you are following this type of dietary pattern, then you are probably likely to be getting a decent amount of your protein from plant sources, and compared to the average Western diet, less of your protein from animal sources. And I think that's really what's going on here, is that folks who are checking a lot of these boxes and adhering to kind of the most commonly recommended eating patterns are just ending up in a situation where they have more of their protein, proportionally speaking, coming from plants. And I just want to be really clear for everyone interesting. If you were to ask me, do I believe, as we see, we're talking about plant versus animal protein here. Do I think if you take a really healthy eating pattern and you add poultry to it, do I think that you've threatened your longevity? Absolutely not. Same thing if you add some fish into it. Absolutely not. So this isn't like me as someone who's mostly vegan saying everyone should eat like me. I can't find literature to indicate that adding poultry or fish or, lower fat dairy or, eggs within certain dosing ranges, these things are not inherently deleterious. But I think when you look at the net impact of an overall eating pattern, I think we're just seeing plant proteins looking so good because if you're someone who's getting a lot of plant proteins, you are probably consuming a broader overall eating pattern that just seems to have a lot of this really healthy stuff in it. So I don't think it's necessarily that animal-based proteins have a deleterious effect that is wiping out the benefit from plant-based protein.
I think that's a fabulous conclusion. It's one I agree with. And I think because we kind of have a bodybuilding lens, sometimes we think vegetable proteins, our assumption is that we're taking a diet, removing meat, and we're adding pea protein, soy protein, etc. But the reality is, in most people who are trying to follow these type of dietary advice that you discussed are recommended by many organizations and health bodies, to eat more vegetable proteins, you're eating more vegetables.
Yep.
So I think that's kind of a sobering reality is we're not talking about taking your current diet and every time you'd eat chicken, you get a scoop of pea protein or soy protein.
Yeah.
So I think that's one thing to discuss. Another final thing I want to add is a bit of a meta brief discussion on study designs and how cognitive biases can kind of play into this. And, good nutrition science works off of a convergence of evidence from different areas. And there's actually a really good recent paper talking about how actually clear it is on the relationship between higher LDL cholesterol and heart disease, when you look at everything all the way done from the 50s, where we actually did have RCTs that are conveniently ignored now, to looking at the effect of statins, which control this, to looking at studies on genetic variants which result in higher or lower levels of this, looking at overall risk exposure. And while each one of those individual study designs could be critiqued because they are not, except for those RCTs that were conveniently forgot, are not causational in nature, when you have all these different ways with different and not necessarily overlapping limitations pointing to the same conclusion, that's when you can say, you know what, we have enough to tip over and say this is a causational factor for heart disease risk. You can do the same thing with vegetable intake or plant-based protein intake. So for example, the limitations that you discussed when discussing limiting methionine or methionine, I always say methionine because, you read it before you hear it. When you talk about limiting methionine in an animal model or limiting protein in an animal model, a lot of limitations that we discussed and how it may not translate to humans. And then when we discuss epidemiological studies where we're seeing a relationship, but there could be healthy user bias or the inability to moderate things or the fact that these are sometimes fundamentally different people, different sets of limitations, but having a similar directionality. So having a conclusion that agrees with both while accepting both limitations and saying something a little broader like you did is the most rational interpretation of the data at hand. So it's hard to disagree. And when you do disagree, you have to look at some of your cognitive biases. So for example, the typical online carnivore proponent, I think, is a good avatar for this. They will say, hey, I've got all these anecdotes of people on the carnivore diet going against the grain, pun intended, and they are doing great in terms of health. So therefore, I think that all this data that you showed me on epidemiology, that's healthy user bias. And you look at them for a second and you go, so you think healthy user bias applies to controlled, statistically moderated epidemiological data spanning 30 years, but healthy user bias wouldn't impact the anecdotes of the 15 friends you have who listen to Huberman or maybe Rogan religiously and only eat meat, and you've been doing that for 3 months and you poop better? Not only does it apply there, but there's even far more limitations. That cognitive bias is one of those things we all have, but it's a really good way to kind of go, oh, hold the phone, like I'm not approaching this rationally. So anyway, I just wanted to point that out, that those 2 points, make sure you're leveling the same critiques to things that you have a bias towards versus a bias against, for and against, and also that you understand that certain fields, you're never going to have true, nail in the coffin causational data, but that does not mean we get to just ignore based upon the limitation we choose when some of them have overlapping, have non-overlapping limitations and therefore complementary strengths where we can come to a very rock solid conclusion about something. And I think the only conclusion that one can have based upon the data here is that vegetables are probably good for you, and it's a good idea to include them. And a movement towards nutritional science generally is moving away from being too reductionist and understanding that in the real world, and all we really can observe is dietary patterns for the most part. And even when you can reduce food items to their constituent nutrients, doing so is taking something away from what is actually in that food matrix and that might have a beneficial impact. So yeah, I think you did a really good job with this, and I just wanted to add those kind of little summary points because, I really enjoyed the article en masse, and I thought you did a great job summarizing here on iron culture.
Well, I appreciate that. And yeah, like you said, I think the key thing there is the reductionist pattern in nutrition, because I think if you wanted to be very reductionist with this, and you may not be wrong in this case, but the very reductionist approach to seeing these findings would be, well, let's go figure out which amino acid is causing all this stuff, right? So that's why I at least presented, it could be that you're on a more plant-based diet, you're getting less of these certain amino acids. Maybe that has something to do with it. But then I think when you kind of take a more expansive view and you say, hey, we're talking about totally different food matrices here in the context of totally different meal compositions, and we're seeing major changes in dietary pattern and eating behavior that go well beyond just taking out one protein source and putting in another, right? So I'm more inclined to believe that there are more things that change when you have a diet that's higher in vegetables and fruits and beans and legumes and nuts and seeds. We're talking about a fundamentally different diet pattern here. And I think sometimes that gets lost as we look for the one little amino acid or the one metabolite of red meat that's causing all of our problems, right? One other thing I wanted to mention, I know I had a little caveat here, but I want to double down on the caveat because I have my spider sense tingling about when I'm about to get owned in the comments. So as I read through the healthy diet indicator criteria, I just want to be extra clear that we are painting with a broad brush here, right? So for example, added sugar is something that they recommend limiting. Now, for the general population, that's a good idea. For people who are very active and weight neutral, there's evidence showing that you can actually have a pretty large amount of added sugar without really having a detrimental impact. Limiting fat to less than 30% of total energy. Some of the best literature out there on the Mediterranean eating pattern has fat intakes in the 35-40% of energy range. So there's nothing wrong with that within the context of a generally healthy eating pattern. I even mentioned as I was going, limiting sodium to less than 2 grams a day. For some people, you are not going to experience any health benefit from taking your sodium down from 6 or 7 grams a day all the way to 2. It seems to be very genetically linked whether or not you are responsive to sodium in the diet. And some people actually, their blood pressure goes up when they really aggressively restrict their sodium. So all of that is to say, these are general broad brush heuristics, and that's why I don't treat them as a literal checkbox where you have to do every single one of them with, perfect adherence, but it does kind of connote a general eating pattern that has a nice blend of electrolytes, not all sodium, no potassium, right? You're getting all these different nutritious food sources in, and you're not getting too out of balance in any one particular direction. So nutrition, I think the main summary here is that nutrition is complicated. And the more that we try to reduce it down to kind of little nifty check boxes or individual ingredients of a food or individual components of a food, we really do risk missing the forest for the trees there. So wrapping up, I know if you're listening to this, you feel pretty fondly about protein, and I'm very pleased to be the person to tell you today that you do not need to break up that love affair. As far as we can tell from the literature, the research linking higher protein to shorten lifespans does not really seem to apply very much to human beings. And in fact, it seems that high protein diets appear to actually help you age in a more healthy way. So eating plenty of protein, being active seems to be really critical for healthy aging. And if you want to throw in there a relatively healthy eating pattern that includes, plenty of vegetables and a variety of foods that isn't totally, skewed toward a very, very heavy meat-based diet, there may be some additional benefits there due to the overall impact of that eating pattern. And the final thing I'll leave you with, we talked about protein dose and hypertrophy and how actually the effect isn't really as big as we are inclined to believe. One thing I'll mention is that we are looking at a very narrow set of things that impact healthy aging here. We've talked a lot about exercise and protein intake. Those are both very important. Exercise, I'm very confident saying exercise way more important to healthy aging than having a high protein intake. But there are other things as well. So make sure that you're sleeping well. Make sure as you're aging that you stay cognitively engaged. Make sure you stay socially engaged. There are a lot of things that impact healthy aging, and I think the folks who age in a very healthy, very successful way are the folks who take a very holistic approach to that. Because you can eat all the protein in the world, but if you're not, maintaining some degree of cognitive activity and you're socially isolated, the literature indicates that your aging outcomes are going to be very, very poor. And so that's something that we should all, I think, plan for if we intend to get older. We really have to think about how are we going to take a very comprehensive approach to aging where we stay engaged in stimulating hobbies and activities. We maintain enriching social relationships. Physical activity and nutrition are just one part of it.
Fantastic summary. And for our co-host who is not here, I know you said that there are no easy reductionist answers, but his tagline, when he ends his YouTube videos of eat your vegetables, folks, you know the rest, does still seem to apply. So you heard it here. Omar Isuf, he's been right on YouTube where everyone else was wrong for almost a decade and a half now. And as much as we did talk some smack about him being the problem in this throuple, maybe he was the solution all along. And I look forward to having him back on next time. But Trex, you did a fantastic job on this one. Great summaries. I've got nothing to add except, hey folks, if you liked this episode, please like it. Also, if you want to go the extra mile and do us a solid, give us a rating and review. A lot of reviews are positive, but you know what? We do enjoy reading the negative ones. And sometimes you can leave a 5-star rating, but then say something negative, and you can really leverage my insecurity to have a fun starting bit to the next episode. And I would highly encourage you to do that. Also, if you have any critiques of any guest, any host, I'm not going to say who you should critique, but I think Eric and I would prefer it wasn't us. You do the math after that. So also, typical ratings most people leave tend to be 5 stars. And, if you want to be an acceptable member of society, just think about what everyone else is doing and be a lemming. And with that, I will say thank you. We'll see you next week, on the same day, insert day here. And I hope you enjoyed the episode. Looking forward to your listenership next time on Iron Culture.